All right. So, looking ahead to next week, we have the main reading is going to be Schiller's Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man. And then we have some literary examples as supplements, which we will discuss some of them in class, but I think they're useful in terms of thinking about the theme for next week, which is Romanticism. And the reason that we're doing it that way is we're moving pretty quickly now. After Kant, do 1 week of Schiller, then we'll do 1 week of Hegel. And Schiller will be the hinge figure between Kant and Hegel. So Schiller will be an opportunity to review some Kant ideas, because he's going to be doing that himself, and then introducing some new ideas and setting us up for Hegel. And Hegel is going to describe modern art as romantic. So the art of his time as romantic. And so we'll be dealing with exactly what that might mean, and how it differs from Kant's view. So Kant, we didn't get into it very much, we might talk about it today a bit, has a view of the different forms of art that's very classicist, we can say. So classicism is what comes before Romanticism. Or we do it as a quick, let's see if this works, timeline proposition. Oop, I didn't tell you that. All right, let me see if I can. I have a dry erase marker that I can use. Oh. Okay, oh, good. False start. You guys don't see any dry erase markers hiding, running around. Yeah, that's okay. But really, the French Revolution, so the end of the 18th and early 19th century, so that sort of century transition, is when classicism goes into a certain kind of crisis and Romanticism emerges. So Kant is living through that time, but it's not really registering for him the way it's going to register most clearly for Hegel, not even so much for Schiller. You'll see that Schiller's ideas, he's very much associated with Romanticism, but his own ideas are still classicist. So in terms of our literary examples, well, we have Wordsworth, The Prelude, which is this massive book. It's essentially Wordsworth's autobiography in verse. So it's of how he came to be the poet that he is. And Schiller is going to be one of three thinkers that we have this semester in this course who are themselves artists. So Schiller's an artist, he's a dramatist, he's a poet, and Nietzsche is a musician, and Adorno is a musician. So we're going to have two musicians and a poet who are practicing artists So Wordsworth is the main, and we'll look at some short poems by Wordsworth. We'll also look at the early draft for the prelude. The others are a little bit more exotic, namely Novalis' Hymns to the Night. But Holderlin, we will have a few poems that we'll look at from Holderlin. Holderlin, who was Hegel's college roommate, and who Hegel is in kind of critical dialogue with around the self-conception of Romanticism.
Love-hate relationship?
No, I wouldn't put it exactly that way. I'd say that Holderlin is a very mercurial figure. And so, it's I don't think that Holderlin has any animus towards Hegel, and Hegel doesn't have any animus towards Holderlin, but there's a kind of pessimism that sets in around the French Revolution in Wordsworth in the prelude. There's actually a key turning point in the prelude where he sees an angry mob on the streets of Paris during the French Revolution, and his whole world is sort of turned upside down by that. All right, so, but for the purposes of writing up notes for next time, 2 volunteers for the Schiller. Okay, you guys coordinate. Good. Excellent. All right. Let's bring up our. Let's see if Kant is still on the hard drive. No, usage lock. Okay. So what I'd like to do today, we're going to talk about the specific reading that we did for today, but I'd also like to take the opportunity to just do a review of Kant. Overall. So before we get into the reading for today, is there anything from last week's reading that we didn't address that you'd like to raise? We didn't get to genius. Okay, thanks for reminding me of that. Okay, so let's talk about that in particular, because it's important. So just to demystify the concept of genius, genius just means, it's just a Latin word for original. Genius just means originality. So there's 2 aspects to that. Here, I can bring up our discussion notes from last time, from what you guys raised about that. But one would be, what makes genius possible in production, but the other is what makes genius possible in terms of recognition. So what makes it possible for people to do something that's new and different, that's original, but also what makes it possible for us to recognize it. So if we go all the way back to the issue of the beautiful, so judging not according to a concept, also judging not according to past experience. So not just familiarity, not just something pleasant in the sense that it's familiar. That would be judging according to a concept. That would be confirming your past experience, confirming your concept of the beautiful. But rather, for Kant, the philosophical question is, what makes it possible for us to take pleasure in the experience of something that is unfamiliar, that's unknown, that's new and different? So why doesn't it just not make sense to us? And if it doesn't make sense to us, it would basically cause us pain in terms of cognition. So the unfamiliar, the unknown, something that doesn't make sense according to past experience one would assume, be discordant in some way. It wouldn't jibe with your subjectivity, and so it would not be seen as beautiful in the sense of giving you pleasure. So the ability to experience something as beautiful, specifically the ability to experience something that's pleasant in a way that is new and different from your past experience. That's really the issue. In my other course on Benjamin, we were just dealing with the issue of experience, like the category of experience. So the subject, but the experiencing subject. So the subject that pre-exists, that's a priori, any experience, any empirical sense data experience, but also the subject that is transformed through experience. So when we talk about experience, we're talking about a kind of processing of sense data perception, processing of stimuli, cognitive processing of the world. But we're also talking about something that adds to you, like having experience develops your subjectivity. So it's the possibility of an aesthetic education, developing your aesthetic judgment through experience, developing your capacities for taste, something that we'll talk about today, through your experience. What makes that possible? That's the real question for Kant. And why that's important is that our faculties of sense data perception, our biological organs as a species, are the same as they were hundreds of thousands of years ago. Of course, in Kant's time, they didn't quite have the archaeological knowledge that we have, but they definitely had a sense that humans have been around for a very long time, and that they're basically the same as they were. Right? Biological evolution doesn't take place on the scale of hundreds or thousands of years, but on the scale of millions of years, in terms of basic things like our ears, our eyes, our brains. So our sense data perception is the same, but our taste and our judgment can change. It can change collectively, socially, culturally. It can also change individually. We can have a more refined taste by virtue of our experience. Refined. Yeah, like, how would you define refined?
Or how did you recognize it's getting change instead of like, there is no competition of like, is it getting better or not? It's
I mean, the assumption here is that more experience is more, right? So it's more opportunity to develop.
Mm-hmm.
So whether that assumption is right,
Yeah.
who knows? But at least, there's the possibility that, education experience, in that sense, exposure to things, processing more things, develops you.
Mm-hmm.
So refined means that we have a more fine-grained judgment. So, think of it in terms of the artist. So, does it help an artist to see other art?
Sometimes.
Generally, we assume so, right? That being exposed to more and more diverse varieties of art is beneficial for your practice as an artist. But why? Right? We might think the opposite. There is this idea of like naive art, outsider art, something like that. Primitivism, right? You know, be like, oh, you know, raw talent is better than art school education. Maybe. So that's the production. What about the consumption? What about the reception? What about the viewing? Does it help to see a lot of art in order to be able to appreciate art, to be able to receive it, to be able to view it? It doesn't? No?
It does.
Not necessarily.
No, I totally does. It's the same as wine.
If you're-
Wine?
Yeah, but if you're indulging a lot of that art,
You said what?
if
Bad
you-
art.
Yeah, if you indulge yourself with garbage content, how can you call
Well,
that?
within that, you're able to distinguish whether it's more garbage or less garbage. Or,
Yeah, you could have a refined taste in garbage.
yeah.
No, so there's the fine arts,
Mhm.
right? Because this is a concept,
Yeah.
fine arts. Like a MFA student is a master in fine arts.
Mhm.
Ooh, yes, fine. Ooh, refined,
Mhm.
fine.
I just feel like there is a certain assumption that this is gonna be more is better, but it's not. That the positive annotation of that.
Well, let's place the emphasis where it should be placed,
Yeah.
because he doesn't think that it's automatically so.
Yeah.
But the possibility
Mhm.
of developing your subjectivity, developing your faculties, developing your capacities through experience.
Mhm.
What makes that possible? It doesn't have to happen, but what makes it possible to happen?
I know people who purposely try to not look at bad arts, that it doesn't like seep into them and then come up in their own art.
Well, what's bad art?
Like, maybe a lot of stuff you see on Instagram. Like, might be good to limit yourself to like look at the stuff in the museum, ARC, rather than like just lots of things you can find online.
There's also, you know, we're immersed in art all the time, right? So there's fine art. So what is fine art? Is a television show fine art? It is. It is. It
It's
actually
experience,
is.
It's a situation.
But also, it is formal,
Mm-hmm.
right? It is. So, you know, a pop song is fine art. It is. It's art. Right? We're not just talking about like a designed object. We're talking about something that is experienced for its own sake. Right? So it's not, oh, how do we make the iPhone pleasant so that people like using it so that they keep buying iPhones rather than buying an Android phone, right? That's different, right? Because that's attached to utility. But if we listen to a pop song, if we watch a television show, if we go to the movies, if we read a novel, if we listen to classical music, if we look at a painting, look at a sculpture, right? We do it for its own sake. We don't do it for any practical reason. Now we might, if we're professional art critics, we might. But then we're like taxonomists of art. And that might get in the way of experiencing it, actually. Right? That would be basically applying a conceptual framework to the art, and then the question of whether you're actually experiencing it as such. Yeah, right? You might, but your first and foremost concern might be to plug it into the discursive apparatus. Right? So all that I'm saying about that is, can we help but consume bad art? We're surrounded by it. We're inundated with it. And not only that, but people have always been. Right? So human cultures have always been suffused with aesthetic experience. Not just the experience of nature, but the experience of cultural aesthetic forms. Usually tied to practical things. So a mixed experience, which we might have of fine art as well. Right? So Is a prayer a poem? Could be, but when you do a prayer in a religious setting, it's not a poem, it's a prayer. Now, of course, you can take it out of that context, and you can appreciate its poetic quality. And then you're looking at it as a piece of literature, or AKA fine art, as opposed to what it originally was, which was an aesthetic form of a religious ritual value. Right, but in the bourgeois era, in the modern era, in bourgeois society, art escapes its ritual function and takes on a life of its own. So it's no longer, and there's a longer history to that too, because obviously all civilizations have had this kind of bourgeois moment when art is consumed for its own sake, when it leaves the precincts of either formal religious or folk religious ritual value, cult value, as or culture. So remember that we read Susan Buck-Morse on the first day of class? So the discourse of visual culture liquidates art as we've known it, as an experience, as a concept, as an institution, as anything. Because if we reduce art back to culture, then we're losing something. And we're losing something not only recent and modern, but also something ancient. So ancient classical civilizations throughout the world have had art that has taken on a life of its own. In the European context, which for obvious reasons is important, because Europe did in fact take over the world. It did. That's done. Including through Marxism. China's been westernized through Marxism. For better or worse? Maybe for worse. Well, who knows? For better or worse. So in that context, the most recent moment of a efflorescence of art that no longer had to justify itself according to caste rituals, the aristocracy or formal religion, or folk rituals, folk life, was in the Renaissance. And that's the beginning of the bourgeois era. And then we carry forth from that. But it reached back, the reason it was called a rebirth is that it reached back to classical antiquity. It reached back to Greek and Roman art. It reached back to another high point in European civilization. Middle Age is not so much of a high point. Not so much, that's why we call it the Dark Ages. So postmodernism messes with all this. It totally liquidates all this. It says, oh no, there's no difference really. No, there's a difference. There's a difference. Europe was backward in the Middle Ages. It definitely was. Relative to the other civilizations, relative to Islam or India or China. It was backward for a good time then. Meaning they didn't have as much room for art. That's one index of that. They didn't have as much freedom, which is what art represents. Art represents that freedom. Were they interested in genius? They were not. They were not. In classical antiquity, they were. In the Middle Ages, they were not. In the Renaissance, they become interested in that again. Right, that's an index of what we're talking about. Right, it's a Latin word for a reason. Okay, so what makes it possible to recognize something as original, as new and different? What makes it possible for us to produce, so not just the experience of nature as new and different, but to produce something not natural, new and different, and to have it recognized by others. Right, so production, consumption, production, reception, these are always connected. Even if nobody sees the art except the artist, how does the artist know that they've produced something new and different? Can the artist surprise themselves and not find something that they've produced nonsensical? Sometimes they do produce something nonsensical, but often they produce something unexpected that is nonetheless not nonsensical. Right? The artist is always the first viewer of their own work. The writer is always the first reader of their own work. The musician is always the first listener to their own work. So how does the artist know whether they've made anything at all? Made something worthwhile? What would that be? Something that you haven't already made before. Right, so again, to demystify the concept of genius, it's actually a kind of an ordinary phenomenon. It is an ordinary phenomenon. Now, of course, there are degrees. There are degrees. There are degrees of things that push the boundary of the new and the different, push the boundaries of experiential capacity. There is the question of recognition. So just as the production through genius, and so the reception of genius has a accidental character, and it has a necessary character. So the accidental character is talent. Right? Are you a talented artist? Are you a talented viewer? Are you a talented listener, a talented reader? There are people who are more talented. There are. But that's an accident. That's a kind of random, phenomenon. So the question is, what's necessary? Not just accidental, but what's necessary. What's the necessary character of genius? What's the necessary character of originality? What's the necessary character of the recognition of originality? Why do we consider it to be a tragedy that artistic genius is unrecognized? If we look back historically, why would we be made sad at the thought that someone produced something original and nobody recognized it?
That doesn't relate to the definition of genius, does it?
No?
There's a symbolic analogy that we tend to follow where there's always a rise and a fall in the timeline overall.
You mean of a person's oof
Yeah.
of their work?
Exactly.
Well, there is that
That's-
question.
Yeah, but that's not, like, it's almost independent from the concept of genius. Like,
Is it? I don't know. People might go through more productive phases in their lives. Again, there might be something accidental about that, circumstantial.
Mhm.
We talked, I think, already mentioned how Kant says, really genius, we're talking about art, not science. But I'll use an example from science, which is that Einstein made all of his great discoveries early in life and then didn't really make any new discoveries for most of the rest of his life. Not necessarily because there was nothing left to discover, although actually physics hasn't advanced very much since then, in general, right? So it might have had an accidental character to it in terms of the biography of the scientist, but it might have had a necessary character to it. Maybe society did not produce the need for physics beyond the quantum mechanics and relativity of the early 20th century. Have you guys seen The Theory of Everything? Have you heard of Stephen Hawking? Right, so like the failed attempt to produce a new synthesis in physics. It's a failure. Didn't happen. It's a tragedy. So, all right, so when we're looking at the criteria, let's see who's answering. Is there Julie? Do you want to say something about what you wrote here about genius?
Once again.
Did you do it last week?
Yes.
You did? Okay,
I did.
sorry. Well, I think the way you laid out here is in more detail than what we might have discussed. So, there are parallels. There's something circular about Kant's argument. So like I said, a lot of what he says with respect to beauty also then comes back to pertain to genius. So, science obeys rules, and therefore, right, genius would apply to art, not science. But product as purpose, maybe you could explain that a bit. Oh, okay, sorry, I won't put you on the spot anymore. All right, so when a work of art is new and original, it's exceeding any kind of definite purpose. All right, so the artist might be intending to make something, and they end up making more than they intended to make. So again, not according to a definite concept, and not according to any previously established rules. And so again, how we understand that, nature and freedom, concepts of nature, the concept of freedom, the dialectic of freedom and necessity. So this is where it's a dialectic. It also flips back. It seems to reverse itself, meaning nature, why Kant thinks nature is a better object for thinking about the beautiful or the sublime than art is that nature has it appears spontaneous, appears undesigned. Talent is a function of nature rather than a function of freedom. So, now again, the dialectic of freedom and necessity means that freedom transforms nature, freedom transforms necessity. So genius as a combination of the necessary and the free, of nature and freedom. So genius has to go beyond raw talent. It has to develop. Because if it remained raw talent, it would simply be nature. It wouldn't be freedom. And what makes genius important is that it's a phenomenon of freedom. Now I'll say this because I know that this is the hard part. Remember, this is the entire course we're going to be dealing with this. We tend to think of freedom as exactly the opposite of what Kant is talking about. We tend to think of freedom as random accident, as the aleatory, as the indeterminate in the sense of the accidental. Why is that not freedom according to Kant? Because we can't take any responsibility for it. We can't own it. It can't be our own. It can't be autonomous. And that paradox is what we're going to really be discussing today in terms of teleological beings and purposiveness in nature. There's a sort of an insoluble conundrum, which is to say, is life the expression of necessity or freedom? Kind of an insoluble conundrum. Where did life come from? Who knows? Maybe it was the product of a random accident. But then the question is, intelligent beings, because all of these categories, genius, beauty, the sublime, freedom, are categories of the subject, namely of intelligent beings. So nature is not free, even though it might have the appearance to us of freedom in its spontaneity. But in its spontaneity, it may not be free, meaning it might just be the product of physical laws that we have yet to discover. But it appears to us as autonomous and free. We have to be careful that we're not projecting on nature and seeing something in it that's not actually there. Again, what's the proof that freedom exists? History. History, historical change. That humans have done things and that they've recognized what they've done. That there's been a process of historical development. That there hasn't just been random circumstantial change. That there's been some kind of purposeful change. But then we'll be asking ourselves, well, what is the purpose of all that? Where are we headed with all this change? What are thousands of years of human history headed towards? Do we know? No, we don't know. We'll see. Schiller and Hegel will take this up a bit more than Kant does. Kant gives us some intimations, but it's there. Right, so the first determination, however, is for its own sake. Meaning, we produce the new and the different for the sake of doing so. We do it just because. Now, of course, it's horrible if you're an artist and you have to try to earn a living, and so you're in your studio and you're like, genius, I need to produce genius now in order to get paid. Right, that's horrible. That's just a tragedy of life. That's not really a function of what Kant's talking about, meaning whether or not the artist is able to make a living on their art, able to have life circumstances to allow them to continue making art, whether their art is recognized adequately. That's not the point. That really isn't the point. Right? That's the practical realm. That's the practical realm. Meaning, in order to be a successful artist, you have to not only have aesthetic judgment, but you also have to have practical reason. In other words, you have to be good at marketing your work, which may not be the same skill set as making good art. Might be the exact opposite skill set. Jeff Koons? Why do we love to hate Jeff Koons? We do love to hate Jeff Koons. Unless people like Jeff Koons. Do people like Jeff Koons? Maybe they like Jeff Koons. Do you guys know who Jeff Koons is anymore? Yeah, of course. Who's the other one? Is it Krista? Krista? Yeah. What's the actual, is that the actual name of the person? No, you're raising a different one?
Yes, maybe a different giant landmarks.
Yeah, so he like rapped the city of Paris or something, or I don't know. Yeah, it's Christo, right? And so, they sort of gimmicky things, but they get a lot of money to do it. Right? Not great art, I don't think. Well, no. Yeah, probably not. Yeah, I'm pretty sure not. But nonetheless, right? They are good operators of the art world, aren't they, evidently? Right? So they might have a talent for that. That's not the same as the genius of art. So, okay. So, I don't know, let me see if we had another sort of notes on genius for me to refer to. No. Okay. Anything else about genius that you guys want to raise before we get into this week? Is that, it's a moment, right? So, in this philosophy, because they're unfolding, they're trying to develop some ideas and also kind of analyze and clarify the point of the text continuing is to further clarify things. There are these moments, right? So these concepts are moments in a larger dialectic. Right, so genius is a moment in the overall argument. All right, so let's see how it might play into where we go next. So, antinomy of taste. Let's talk about the antinomy of taste. Or, we should start there. Hold on. Maybe we start. Oh no, we could start. Okay. Actually, let's look at Judgement. Like let's look at your notes. Beauty is a symbol of morality. That's a good one. Let's talk about that. Others. Oops, wait. Sorry. Still in part one. Okay. Beauty is the symbol of morality. That's a good one. It's a nice chunky idea. Description that we have. So, what did you mean by the picturesque? Mm-hmm.
And he said that reference to this analogy is truer even with a common understanding. The second. And we often describe beautiful objects of nature or art by names that seems to put a moral appreciation at their basis. We call buildings or trees majestic and magnificent, landscape lovely and good. Even colors are called innocence, modest, tender because they excite sensations which have something analogous to the consciousness of the state of mind brought about by moral judgment. So that reminds me of the picturesque, which means usually charming or quaint. And the picturesque is an aesthetic idea introduced by William Gilpin in 1782 in Observations of the River Wye, and the practical guide taught travelers to view landscape according to picturesque beauty. It's like classical guided French, the objective standard by Antinomy.
Okay, so let's talk about that moral quality to the descriptions that we give of beautiful things, beautiful objects, or beautiful phenomena. Why? Well, first of all, he's using moral in a very peculiar sense, isn't he? So, I think that we talked about how the critique of practical reason, the second critique, is a critique of the possibility of reason and reason is a moral faculty. Now, it's moral in two senses. One is, how do we practice things in a moral way? Practice according to a criterion of the good, but also how do we change our morality? How do we develop our morality? How do we develop the good that we desire in practice and achieve it in practice? So moral has a slightly different connotation than ethics. So ethics and morality are a little bit different. Morality is broader and more social in character, more collective in character. And we could also say it's not just concerned with the principle, but is also concerned with the practice. When we read Nietzsche, he's going to address this very directly on the genealogy of morals. So he's going to talk about the morality of mores. The morality of mores, meaning the morality that only cares about what people do, rather than what they have as an intention, right? So no separation of the doer and the deed, just the practical action itself. So that's actually close to what Kant means by morality. Meaning it has the character of something positive in a practical sense.
So it's like as long as the effect or the influence itself produces something positive, it doesn't matter.
Right, so it's the appearance itself that has this quality, and he's interested in knowing what that means, what that's about.
Then what's the definition of ethics? And
Ethics would be more like the principle according to which, like and it's a more kind of individual, psychological, dispositional, like how you're trying to conduct yourself according to what principles. So it's a little bit different. They have slightly different connotations. They're not equivalent concepts, and especially bringing out the rationality of the action itself rather than just the desirability of its outcome. Right, so when we're talking about phenomena that are beautiful objects of beauty that have this character, that have a kind of edifying character, that have a kind of a dignity about them, why would that be the case? Right, so it seems that they kind of fulfill themselves in a particular way. So he's doing this as a kind of a bridge. So why this moment in the text comes where it does is that he's actually setting up the teleological judgment this way. So we've encountered the first definition that he had, purposiveness without purpose. Purposiveness without purpose. But not just any old purposiveness without purpose, but something that has the quality or the character of a moral purpose. So moral purposiveness without purpose. Right, so not just a purposiveness without purpose, but also something that seems that it has the character of something dignified, exalting, edifying. Right, kind of a higher purposiveness without purpose, if that makes any sense. Right, so again, in the character of the phenomenon itself, rather than any result of it. So when we say that a landscape is like a smiling landscape, a happy landscape, right? Well, happiness is usually associated with a kind of practical satisfaction. So how could that possibly be the case of a landscape? It can't, right? And yet it appears that way to us. It has that quality. I was trying to define a aesthetic quality of something in the way it appears to us. So trees, how could a tree be majestic? how could an animal appear to have a kind of noble character? Right? These are not really appropriate categories, and yet we do use words like that to characterize things. So what we're characterizing is not the thing in itself, but our experience of it, how it appears to us. So we do associate moral, practical functions with an aesthetic quality. So remember that in terms of these three critiques, in terms of the true, the good, the beautiful, the understanding, reason, practical reason, and aesthetic judgment, we're not actually talking about separate things. We're analyzing something, breaking it down into its component parts. We are experiencing everything all the time in these terms. Right, so again, when a concept seems to fit our understanding of things, we feel good about it. So the application of a concept has an aesthetic character. It has a character of aesthetic judgment. Right, whether a concept applies to something does involve a judgment, does involve a feeling, does involve an intuitive sense. Right, so again, all these things are not actually separate, but it does make sense to separate them analytically in order to specify the different aspects of our faculties. So taste makes possible the transition without any violent leap from the charm of sense to habitual moral interest. So habitual moral interest would be practical interest. Right, so we have a practical interest, but also we have an aesthetic feeling associated with that. And so how is that the case? For it represents the imagination in its freedom as capable of purposive determination for the understanding, and so it teaches us to find, even in objects of sense, a free satisfaction apart from any charm of sense. This is kind of a little bit woolly. How do we follow these terms? So charm allows for the free play of the imagination, but it's distinguished from beauty because it doesn't resolve into any definite object. Right, so it's a kind of an imagined object. So we can take aesthetic satisfaction in looking at ripples on water, or wind going through foliage, or watching flames of a fire. Right, there's no definite object, so it doesn't resolve as something that we'll be talking about today as a teleological being. Right, it does seem like a epiphenomenon. Right, it doesn't have a kind of self-contained, self-determining character, but we do take pleasure in it. So what kind of pleasure do we take in it? We do take an aesthetic pleasure in it. How to characterize that aesthetic pleasure? Charm. And so that's the way he's using that term here. That I think that I mentioned that next week we'll be talking about the form drive, the sense drive, and the play drive. So we've encountered this term sense before as related to practical reason. Right, so when we find something charming, it has the character of sense in the sense that it seems to function smoothly. It's not discordant. It's a kind of harmonious action. Right, but he's calling that the charm of sense. Now, again, when we're experiencing that, we're using our imagination, meaning we're actually seeing more, we're constructing more in our imagination than is simply there by virtue of sense data, perception, stimulation. And so when we're charmed by the flames of a fire, it's because our imagination is making sense of it, seeing forms in it, seeing forms in the action of it that aren't, strictly speaking, there. They're more sort of imputed, and they're more in our mind than they are in the phenomenon itself. So that's the freedom. Our mind is free to do that with sense data perception. So, let's back up a second. Morality, so I'll just make reference to something that we haven't read by Kant, and that's his groundwork for the metaphysics of morals and his categorical imperative that has two aspects. The first criterion of moral behavior for Kant, the kind of baseline, is that to act in such a way that if everyone were to act that way, it would be good. So it's different from a particular ethical judgment. It's more situational. Meaning it doesn't mean that everyone should act the same way all the time. That's not the point. The point is that it can fulfill a moral character that transcends the particular instance. So to act in such a way that if everyone were to act that way, it would be good. And the second criterion is to treat others as ends in themselves and not merely as means. So we do treat each other as means. We're all practical means for getting what we want for each other. We use each other. Practically, we do that. Can't help but do that. But to treat others not merely as means, but as ends in themselves. And the reason that that's important is that, of course, human beings are capable of more than the specific or particular purposes to which they're put in any given instance. Right? To respect the freedom in others in the sense that we are free, and therefore that freedom has a universal character. Okay, so beauty as the appearance of morality is moral also in that sense of being universal in character. Meaning, again, not that everyone's going to judge the particular phenomena the same way. Not that everyone is going to regard anything as beautiful, but that they could. That they could. And that's what's universal about the faculty of aesthetic judgment, aesthetic imagination, is that we're all capable of it. Without us needing, so it's universal without us necessarily having a universal understanding, a universal concept or a universal theory. Still, that faculty is universal. And because it's universal, we respect it in others, we respect it in ourselves. That's what gives it a moral quality. Let's talk about the antinomy of taste. Start with David's notes.
So basically, so there's
is it evolved around two conflicting propositions. The first one is the thesis and the antithesis, and the thesis is that the judgment of case is not based on concept, and the antithesis is that it's based on concept, and the solution Kant gave was that both of them are simultaneously true. But they're true because they're referring to different part of the document, and those documents cannot be based on objective concept, but it can be claimed universally through the shared knowledge of human cognition. It's kind of similar to Rupia's symbol morality, because it's like what you said about the categorical imperative and the forming of the universal law. And in other words, so Kant described those as so when making ethical decision, one should ask if the decision could be made in the universal law that everybody should follow. If the answer is no, then the decision is morally wrong. And just kind of similar to what Kant is saying here is that is subjective. We need to look at things from different perspectives.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit. So thesis and antithesis here, different aspects. So one way that he actually describes this is subjective and objective, which is a very strange way of putting it. The way we normally use these terms, it's a very peculiar kind of way of thinking about it. Kant's known as the antinomical thinker, meaning he analyzes things through antinomies. He tends to be neglected as a dialectical thinker, but the point of the antinomy is the dialectic, right? So here, subjective and objective would be subjective and universal. Or we could say universal and particular. So the subjective would be the particular, the objective would be the universal. So what is actually objective? Well, the structure, right, of human cognition. So again, our subjectivity has both a particular and universal character. Our subjectivity has both a subjective and an objective character. Objective in the sense of a structure. So judgments of taste, the thesis, is not based on concepts. So why? Because it can't be proven. It's not subject to that kind of criteria of a logic of understanding. And also, what follows from that is that it's not according to any rule. So to say judging without a concept means judging without a rule, judging without a logical explanation. Because if it could be demonstrated through a logical explanation, then it would be merely the exercise of the understanding. It would be merely conceptual or theoretical. It wouldn't actually be judgment, aesthetic judgment. Okay, so the antithesis is the opposite. So the antithesis is that the judgment of taste is based on concepts. For otherwise, despite its diversity, its particular character, we could not quarrel about it and we would not try to convince other people of the rightness of our judgments. Right, so one way of thinking about this is we know that everyone has their own particular taste. However, because we know that everyone has the capability of taste, at least to some degree, taste is universal. So we know to each his own, each according to his own taste, but also, so people will or do judge things in a particular way, but they could judge it the same way. That's possible. So what's possible is the faculty of judgment itself. That's what's universal. That's what that possibility is based on. Right, so he's kind of flipping it around. So he's saying, okay, we can't make it controversial or debate it according to logical proof, but we can quarrel over it, we can disagree over it, and we can disagree over it in such a way where we try to convince other people of the rightness of our judgment. So why? Well, because we know that people may not share our particular judgment, but we also think they could. And that's why we might try to show them that they're wrong, that this work of art is good, for example. So they demand universal agreement because the validity of a judgment is based on a faculty that is universal. But they're not going to get universal agreement. So they demand universal agreement, but knowing that they're not going to achieve that. All right, so let me look at what you wrote here. The judgment is not based on objective concepts, but it can still claim universality through the shared structures of human cognition. So again, we all have this possibility. That's the universality of it. The universality is a possibility, it's an ought. It could and should be, but it isn't necessarily. So if you think about the is and the ought, what is and what ought to be, it isn't necessarily universal, but it could and should be universal. So the universality of taste, universality of judgment is an ought proposition. It's not a is proposition. Do it for time. All right, let's talk about the method and what that might mean, that paradoxical formulation. Let me bring up the text. All right, let's just look at this. So this is the conclusion. The summary statement that he's got. The division of a critique into elementology and methodology, meaning the logic of its elements versus the logic of its method, as preparatory to science, is not applicable to the critique of taste, not applicable to an account of the possibility of taste, because there neither is nor can be a science of the beautiful. And the judgment of taste is not determinable by means of principles. As for the scientific element in every art, which regards truth in the presentation of its object, this is indeed the indispensable condition, or the conditio sine qua non, of beautiful art, but not beautiful art itself. There is therefore for beautiful art only a manner or a mode, not a method of teaching. The master must show what the pupil is to do and how he is to do it, and the universal rules under which at last he brings his procedure serve rather for bringing the main points back to his remembrance when occasion requires, rather than prescribing them to him. All right, so let's unpack that. So it's a means of reflection rather than a means of actually doing. Nevertheless, regard must be had here to a certain ideal, which art must have before its eyes, although it cannot be completely attained in practice. And by the way, this recalls the beautiful, which he said, okay, judging not according to a concept, but according to an idea. So the difference between a concept and an idea, a concept is something that we grasp something with, and the word is begriff. Whereas idea is something that, as he puts it, cannot be completely attained in practice. So an aesthetic idea or an aesthetic ideal, an object is judged beautiful in its beautiful aspect, meaning as it appears to us to be beautiful, and that's according to an idea that the object suggests without the object actually practically fulfilling it. It is only through exciting the imagination of the pupil to accordance with a given concept by making him note the inadequacy of the expression for the idea, to which the concept itself does not attain because it is an aesthetical idea, and by severe criticism that he could be prevented from taking the examples set before him as types and models for imitation, to be subjected to no higher standard or independent judgment. It is thus that genius, and with it the freedom of the imagination, is stifled by its very conformity to law. And without these, no beautiful art and not even an accurately judging individual taste is possible. So here he's got the dialectic running from phrase to phrase. Okay.
So the point that the beauty in the art comes from the idea which we access through imagination is the thing that lifts art above everything else.
Well, that it makes the beautiful object, whether of nature or of art, appear to be more than what it is. Meaning, that's the paradox or the contradiction. We are seeing more in the natural object that we judge to be beautiful than is actually empirically there.
What more is that?
It's as we're constructing it. It's as we're constructing it in our imagination. In other words,
because we don't see more, but we feel more.
We feel more. We imagine more. It's really the imagination.
But what do we imagine? Because when I see something beautiful, I like to think that I see it for how it is, and that's what the experiencing the aesthetically is, right?
That's the appearance. That's the appearance. So I'll jump ahead a couple of weeks and bring up something that Hegel's going to say, which is that a painted portrait can be a truer likeness of the person than the person is themselves in the flesh. Extremely paradoxical, because of course we're steeped in all this barbaric stuff, theories of representation. No. Because that would lead you to think that the painted portrait is always less than the physical person that's being painted. Sure, in one sense perhaps. But the real issue is, how is the painting more than the physical appearance of the person? So why? Because the painter is not painting the physical appearance of the person, but also painting the idea of the person. And not the conceptual idea, but the aesthetical idea of the person. So that's how the artwork can be more than the physical, natural object.
Could the aesthetical idea of the person, could you summarize that as your experience of that person?
Yes.
That's the imagination.
Would you say, so the word essence is used often in art history, is that the same as essence?
I mean, it depends, because you could talk about it as, usually essence is like the essence of the form or the medium or the genre, right?
Yeah.
And so that would be more like what that form or that genre or medium can do, right?
I'm thinking of
Aesthetically.
it in terms of like the post-impressionists with their bright colours. They're trying to get to the essence of the experience.
Essence of the experience, okay. Essence of the experience. Rather than the essence of the object. Essence of the experience. Well, again, what would the essence of the experience be? We're going to encounter this again with Hegel. Essence and substance as synonymous. They're not always exactly synonymous, but in this case they're synonymous. Meaning substance, what's the basis of the experience? Is the basis of the experience the empirical phenomenon, or is the basis of the experience the imagination? Right, so that's, in other words, they would also say that they're trying to capture like the essence of something. To use Kant's language would mean capturing the idea of it. Right, so the aesthetical idea of it would be the essence of it. So now here's another way of putting it. So when we are making art, we're not visual art. Let's keep it at the level of visual art. The plastic arts, the visual arts, painting and sculpture. So we're objectifying, right? So we're making something that then people can look at, creating an object. What is it that we're trying to imitate, objectify? We're trying to objectify our aesthetic experience of something. So what you're trying to reproduce, what you're trying to replicate, is you're trying to capture the essence of your experience of something. So the reason a painted portrait of someone can be a truer likeness than the physical presence of the person can be is because true to what? The essence of what? To the idea of the person in the mind of the painter. And can they communicate that to others? Right, so the painting is not objectifying sense data perception, it's objectifying the imagination.
I do have another question, but it might kind of derail our topic on so I can save it for later if you prefer.
But what is it?
Okay, so I see what you're saying about how visual arts kind of draws on the imagination of other, our aesthetic experience in life. Sometimes I think about non-objective art, meaning, say, a painting, it creates its own essence.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I think about some artists, so I think a lot about repetition and working in series.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you have an artist that works in series and the paintings they're technically different, but for me the essence is the same.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have other artists, like say, and not everybody sees this, but I think from around it, the paintings are equally technically different, and they're very similar, but the essence is particular each time.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if I'm using the word essence correctly there, but
Mm-hmm.
I guess it's like, in a way, a painting creates, it births a new essence of itself, like,
Right.
separate from our experience of life.
Right. Right. So, I mean, one very simple way of putting it is that art would be necessary insofar as, rather than superfluous, insofar as it gives us something more, rather than giving us something less. So if it's just a representation, then it's giving us something less. And then it's not really necessary at all. It's kind of superfluous. Right? Why do you need a painting of someone when you have them? Well, because actually art is necessary because it gives us something more. It gives us something that we can't I mean, there are two things. One is that it gives us more in the sense that the imagination gives us more than the natural world. And the other is that the artwork itself might be producing something more than just a reproduction of the artist's own imagination. Right, so, again, that you're actually doing something, that you're accomplishing something, that you're making something that justifies its existence. It isn't like unnecessary in the sense of being superfluous, but is necessary in the sense that we generally think that humans do need to, and we need other humans to produce, in a state of freedom, produce something more, add to the world through their art making. So, again, the issue is we do see more than is there in nature. We also see more than is there in the physical artwork. So part of the talent or the genius of the artist is to make us see more than is actually physically there. Mm-hmm.
So I have a slightly different view than what Kant is suggesting here.
Mm-hmm.
And again, if I'm like derating them, I'm just talking.
Go ahead.
But I would just say that I wouldn't say that in a beautiful work of art I'm seeing more than is there. I would say that typically in life we don't see what is there because we're not paying attention to it. And a work of beauty compels us to attend to it in a way to see it aesthetically, which means see it for what it is. And so in that way you're not seeing more than what is there, you're just seeing it, what is there, but more clearly than usually throughout life. And it's the purpose of art to make itself visible. And this is strictly for non-objective art, which is, as you said, is to create something which then makes itself visible as well. And engages our perception, our aesthetic perception.
So you mean non-objective in the sense of non-figurative or non-representational?
Right, yeah.
Which is something that isn't quite there on its own in Kant's time yet. Right? It does come. In other words, that value, that aesthetic value, is sort of an element of art without it standing on its own yet. And then the question would be, well, why did artists feel the need to separate that out and isolate that aspect of things and make it stand on its own? It's a good question. Because, again, that kind of abstraction and, kind of medium essentialism or something, it just would not have made sense to artists before a certain moment in history. Right? It would have just been seen as an aspect or an element, an ingredient, rather than something that could be a value in itself. So this is something to keep in mind. So Kant, that's not a phenomenon for Kant. And so then the question is, what made that possible? What made that necessary, rather than a kind of an accident or some kind of freakish wrong turn that artists took in modernism, in sort of high modernism, and in late modernism, and that we still are doing. Because abstract expressionism is already late modernism and already has a sort of postmodernist quality, even though post-abstract expressionism is usually what's associated with postmodernism. Even abstract expressionism already has a kind of postmodernism to it. But we'll get there. And that's what I'm going to have to try to find a dry erase marker for. Because I do want to plot these things out so you guys know how I'm using terms historically. All right, let's take a break. Resume. right, so let's try to make the transition, because we only have an hour left, to the teleological judgment. Because this is, in some ways, the whole point of the book, or it's the ultimate example of what he's talking about. So if we keep in mind, we just have the chart up. Let's recall that for a second. That the three phenomena that Kant is analyzing with respect to the exercise of the faculty of judgment. We have beautiful objects, sublime forces. So we have the sublime applied to things that appear as a force rather than as an object. And now we're coming to teleological beings. And teleological beings are life forms, forms of life, to use a Nietzsche expression, but life forms that combine the character of object and force. And I associated these different phenomena, the kind of analytical distinctions there, actually to Kant's whole system of philosophy. Namely, that the judgment of beautiful objects is most closely related to the exercise of the understanding, the application of concepts, theories. The judgment of sublime forces is most closely associated or related to practical reason. And then finally, the aesthetic judgment itself is most akin to the phenomenon of teleological beings. Okay, so how and why is that the case? So if we go all the way back to the beautiful, that the beautiful object doesn't appear to be determined in the way that a conceptual object is determined. Meaning, when something appears to us to be beautiful, when we judge it to be beautiful, even though it might be an inert object, it appears to be alive. So a painting is just pigment on a surface. And yet, part of the aesthetic character of it is that it seems to come to life under the view of the onlooker, the subject. So it's not actually coming to life, and yet it appears to have a kind of liveliness about it. It has a living quality to it. So it's an example of us seeing something that's not empirically there, it's not physically there, it's there in our imagination, it's there subjectively for us. But then the question is, what does it mean for something to appear to us as alive? So something appears alive to us when it appears to be autonomous, when it appears to be self-determining, when it appears to be ruling itself. So purposiveness without purpose. And then the first section of this part of the book, the purposiveness of nature. Purposiveness without purpose, that means without an external purpose. So it has itself as its own purpose. It doesn't exist for some other purpose. It doesn't exist for something else, but seems to exist for itself. To exist for its own sake. Anything actually alive has that character, and then anything aesthetically that we judge to be pleasant in this way, especially beautiful objects, but then again with teleological beings, also has this character. It has the character of bringing itself into existence, determining its own existence. It exists through an act of self-creation. It has a kind of autonomous character. Now we'll see there's a paradox inherent in this. But we'll get there. So the objective purposiveness of nature is section 61. He says, we have on transcendental principles good ground. You know how ground is a transcendental principle, but there we go. To assume a subjective purposiveness in nature, in its particular laws in reference to its comprehensibility by human judgment, and to the possibility of the connection of particular experiences in a system. This may be expected as possible in many products of nature, which, as if they were devised quite specifically for our judgment, contain a specific form conformable thereto, which through their manifoldness and unity, so two kind of opposed characteristics, serve at once to strengthen and to sustain the mental powers that come into play in the employment of this faculty, and to which therefore we give the name of beautiful forms. But that the things of nature serve one another as means to purposes, and that their possibility is only completely intelligible through this kind of causality, for this we have absolutely no ground in the universal idea of nature as the complex of the objects of sense. All right, so let's unpack that. All right, so we understand that natural phenomena do exist within a physical universe in which everything is causing everything else, everything is linked in some way. But when we're looking at it that way, we're looking at it according to our practical reason, again, our sense. In the above-mentioned case, the representation of things, because it is something in ourselves, can be quite well thought a priori as suitable and useful for the internally purposive determination of our cognitive faculties. But that purposes which neither are our own nor belong to nature, so not just a physical system of nature, nor just our own cognitive faculties and their function. And he says, for we do not regard nature as an intelligent being, and we'll see why he thinks that, could or should constitute a particular kind of causality. So not a causality, not a logic of our subjective faculties, nor a logic of the physical universe. At least a quite special conformity to law. This we have absolutely no a priori reason for presuming. Yet more, experience itself cannot prove to us the actuality of this. Okay, so an a priori reason for presuming those two things. Physical laws of the universe, the internal consistency and logic of our faculties subjectively. Experience itself cannot prove to us the actuality of this, meaning in our empirical experience, this is never going to be proven. There must then have preceded a rationalizing subtlety which only sportively introduces the concept of purpose into the nature of things, but which does not derive it from objects or from their empirical cognition. Empirical cognition just means our experience, our cognitive experience. To this latter, it is of more service to make nature comprehensible according to analogy with the subjective ground of the connection of our representations than to cognize it from objective grounds. So our representations means like our mental images. We were talking about the aesthetical idea of something rather than its empirical appearance. Further, objective purposiveness, as a principle of the possibility of things of nature, is so far removed from necessary connection with the concept of nature that it is much oftener precisely that upon which one relies to prove the contingency of nature and of its form. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, again, our making sense of the natural universe is going to be according to our concept of the laws of nature. But we already have some experience of us changing how we conceive of the laws of nature. Right, so scientific discovery, scientific theory, right, which tends to be, right, so there's no necessary connection between our concept of nature and what nature actually is.
That's not assumption, right? That's, what is it? It's not an assumption.
Well, we have a sense that there's always something more to discover in nature, and there's always some improvement to our understanding of the physical laws of the universe. Like that's, he thinks, we have that kind of, at least now, maybe not always, but at least now, we do have that sense. So he says, when, for example, we adduce the structure of a bird, the hollowness of its bones, the disposition of its wings for motion and of its tail for steering, etc., we say that all this is contingent in the highest degree according to the mere nexus effectivus of nature, without calling in the aid of a particular kind of causality, namely that of purpose. And he calls that nexus finalis. In other words, nature considered as mere mechanism, and this is something that you guys raised in your notes, could have produced its forms in 1,000 other ways without stumbling upon the unity which is in accordance with such a principle. It is not in the concept of nature, but quite apart from it, that we can hope to find the least ground a priori for this. Okay, now, came to the point. Nevertheless, the teleological act of judgment, so that's the judgment, making a judgment, act of judgment, making a judgment, in a way that has as its logic a goal or a purpose, teleological, is rightly brought to bear, at least problematically, upon the investigation of nature. Right, so when we're investigating nature, we're usually not trying to figure out the purpose of things. We're just looking at the function of things. Right, so why this species of bird looks the way it does. Right, we're concerned with how it functions, we're not concerned with why it has this particular form, because we know actually birds can accomplish the same thing without just that particular form. But only in order to bring it under principles of observation and inquiry according to the analogy with the causality of purpose, without any pretense to explain it thereby.
What is with the, what is the last bit? Without any pretense to explain.
Okay, so we can say a bird has wings in order to fly, but we can't say, why does a bird need to fly? Right? Right?
So we don't question that.
Well, it's, he's just, again, setting up a distinction between the function of something and the purpose of something. So we can say how it flies, we can't say why it flies. It belongs, therefore, to the reflective and not to the determinate judgment. So the determinate judgment would be something like, why do birds exist? Right? The reflective judgment would be, how do their wings work? Because what makes a bird is that it has wings. Right? That's how we define what a bird is, pretty much. Except for the flightless birds, but even they have wings, but they don't fly with those wings. The concept of combinations and forms of nature in accordance with purposes is then at least one principle more for bringing its phenomena under rules where the laws of simply mechanical causality do not suffice. Where we bring in a teleological ground, or a logic of purpose, where we attribute causality in respect of an object to the concept of an object, as if it were to be found in nature and not in ourselves. So again, why do birds exist? Like we can say birds are defined by the fact that they're animals that fly, and we can talk about the form that they have that allows them to fly, but we can't say why birds exist. In other words, why are there animals that fly?
So here is he not rejecting, but is he disregarding the scientific information such as like evolution?
Well, I mean, no, not necessarily, because he would say that, again, science can kind of understand nature without explaining why it exists. Because even Darwinian evolution can't explain that. It would just be random mutation. Right? It would just be like, well, why do birds exist? Because there was a random mutation, and at some point an animal could fly through random mutation, and that turned out to be advantageous. Survival of the fittest just so happened that flying is a good thing, and therefore, right? But strictly speaking, I guess there were times when there were no flying animals.
You could take into account like the geological circumstances where certain birds or certain animals in a certain location would have benefited from flying.
From flight.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. So when all the animals lived in the ocean, they didn't need to fly. Although I think that they still did fly. Because fish, jump out of the water, and that turns out to be helpful too. Right? Again, he's doing a kind of analysis. Right? So he's saying, science can tell us how things work, it can't tell us why things exist. Now, if you bring in like an evolutionary story, then you're saying how evolution works.
Yeah.
You're not saying why
It
it happened, right? So again, what's meant by teleology? What's meant by the telos? If we did not ascribe to it such a method of action, its causality would have to be represented as a blind mechanism. If, on the contrary, we supply to nature causes acting designedly, and consequently place at its basis teleology, not merely as a regulative principle for the mere judging of phenomena, to which nature can be thought as subject to its particular laws, but as a constitutive principle of the derivation of its products from their causes. Then would the concept of a natural purpose no longer belong to the reflective, but to the determinate judgment. Then, in fact, it would not belong specially to the judgment, like the concept of beauty, regarded as formal subjective purposiveness, but as a rational concept it would introduce into natural science a new causality, which we only borrow from ourselves and ascribe to other beings, without meaning to assume them to be of the same kind with ourselves. Okay, let's unpack that. So, again, what would that new causality be? Because this is where he's really going. He's going into what nowadays, or more recently, historically, was called intelligent design. Meaning, did we have random mutation and survival of the fittest? Or did God design everything? Is there intelligent design? Now, what Kant is saying is that there isn't intelligent design, but it's going to appear to us as if there is. So nature was not designed by an intelligent being, but our experience of nature will lead us to believe that it was designed by an intelligent being. All right, so do you guys know the intelligent design debates? Have you like, been exposed to this kind of debate between like Darwinian evolutionists versus intelligent design theorists? So the intelligent design theorists are like, how could something that functions so elegantly ever have just happened by random chance? Right? So that would be a perfect example of what Kant's talking about, which is that it just seems completely implausible that, I mean, there's a little bit of variety of that with like the COVID-19 like lab origin theory, which is like, oh, well, it must have been like enhanced by Dr. Fauci and his minions, right? Which doesn't disprove the lab leak theory, it doesn't. But we could say that what people are doing is trying to attribute a purpose to the phenomenon that it may not actually have. Right, so why people would go there, why people would reach for that kind of an explanation rather than accepting that it's a random accident. Again, maybe it was a enhanced, what do they call it? What's the technique? Why am I blanking on this? I'm so traumatized by the COVID era, I really am. All this stuff is like seared on my mind, and I have hysterical amnesia about it. No, what is it called? No, it's not like a weapon. It's a, they do it to test, like they accelerate the evolution of the virus. It is like an enhanced something. I forget.
Overexposure?
No, it has to do with what they do. Like because they don't, I think that they do it, one of the reasons why they do it in other countries rather than the United States is that there's actually a ban on doing it in the United States. Did you guys also hear that they do it in the Ukraine?
Rights of virus?
No, because it's unsafe. Right? So the idea is like, yeah, we'll do those experiments in China because we don't do them in the United States because they're unsafe to do here. So whereas if it happens in China, it has to burn through 1 billion Chinese before it gets here. Watch out, children. Conspiracy theory, blah, blah, blah. Okay, Wikipedia, we'll trust Wikipedia, although Wikipedia is all written by Maoists. I know from personal experience because they don't like me. So that's why I don't have a Wikipedia entry. I did, and then they deleted it because they're Maoists. I tracked it down. I figured it out, those motherfuckers. All right, so let's see, what do they call it?
Genome engineering.
Yeah, but it's a particular kind of engineering. I'm sorry we're going down this highway. Oh no, it's the Mojan copper mine. This is just such an amazing story, isn't it? Meaning it's pangolins, it's bats, it's this, it's that, it's the other thing. Yeah. Oh no, the seafood market. Okay, the wet market. Zoonosis. Okay. Gain of function. See, children, you're supposed to know this language. Aren't you guys traumatized by this enough? You never heard of gain of function research? You don't watch enough Fox News? Children, you need to watch your Fox News, especially because we'll be getting Trump again, hopefully in a month and a half. So you gotta get down with the party line. Get ready. Gain of function research. Gain of function research. So that's when they enhance the virus in order to see how it might mutate, right? So it's to kind of accelerate changes in the virus structure or whatever. So gain of function research. And so that's how they try to prove that it's a lab leak rather than zoonotic, because they try to show that in the genetics of the virus are like artifacts of like gain of function, right? So, and who knows? Who knows? We will never know, because the conspiracy of the CIA and the Chinese Communist Party will forever bury this. So So we'll never know that. But what is Kant saying? Kant's saying, well, why do we go there? Right? Why do we go there? And the intelligent design people are like, well, God made it that way. Whereas the conspiracy theorists are like, actually, it was the Chinese Communist Party and Anthony Fauci and the deep state and the CIA and I don't know who else. Somebody along the lines. So some intelligence is at work. But let's keep it to the God point. Let's keep it to the God point. So intelligent design must have been designed by an intelligence. And how do we understand that intelligence? We can understand that intelligence as either an external intelligence, God created the world, or because he brings in Spinoza, he calls it hylozoism, that nature is intelligent. In other words, the universe has an intelligence. So basically what you have there is a kind of monism or a dualism. So the dualism is God and God's creation, and the monism would be, well, God is nature, nature is God, God is the universe is God, rather than God creating the universe, God creating nature. Rather, it's nature itself that is God. So he doesn't like that idea either, though. Right? So he thinks in either case, what we're doing is attributing to nature something that it actually doesn't have in itself. And we're doing that because we're projecting ourselves into nature. So now, let's unpack that a bit. So the intelligence that we see at work in nature is actually only the intelligence of our understanding of nature.
It's a reflection.
Yeah, it's a reflection. So it's the intelligence of our making sense of nature. So really, he's not like arguing atheism. He's arguing agnosticism. Meaning, maybe God did create the world, but philosophically you can't prove that. What can you prove philosophically is that when we think we're seeing the hand of God, we're only seeing our own understanding. Right, which leaves aside whether or not God actually did create the world and make it the way it is. We're confusing our understanding for the thing itself. Right, so philosophically, we can never get to the bottom. He actually has an essay on this called Religion as looked at from the point of view of reason alone. And this is where Kant says, actually philosophy can't prove the existence or non-existence of God. And so therefore, the existence or non-existence of God is a matter of faith alone, not of reason. The intelligent design people, on the other hand, think that looking at nature, you can prove the existence of God, because look at how well designed nature is. And because nature is so well designed, there must be a God. And what Kant is saying is that's a mistake. That's a kind of fallacy. That's an illusion. It's an understandable illusion, but it's nonetheless an illusion. Now, of course, actual theologians will say that because the intelligent design people are not actually theologians, it's more like crackpot, like pseudoscience, than it is like actual theology, because actual theology will say God is a matter of faith alone. In other words, you will see evidence of God as a function of your faith, right? Not because you're actually seeing evidence of God. Because God can't be proven, because if God could be proven, it wouldn't be God anymore. So, in other words, we have reason and God wants us to use our reason, but our reason is not to like prove or disprove God. So that would be actual theology as opposed to the pseudo-theology and pseudoscience of intelligent design. Nonetheless, Kant thinks this is where this misapprehension might come from. So what he thinks the purposiveness of nature actually does, it doesn't prove the existence of God, it proves the reality of our aesthetic subjectivity. It proves the reality of our aesthetical judgments. And it proves the reality of our aesthetical judgments as a phenomenon of freedom, meaning
Because we're projecting and associating ourselves, that means we are actually acting in these judgments.
right. So we're
It's a little bit of Freud, isn't
maybe.
it? Yeah, with the
Maybe.
projection.
Oh, you mean like psychologically?
Yeah.
Right. Well, okay, so the difference between Kant and Freud in that one would be that Freud would turn into a kind of compulsion, kind of psychological compulsion, whereas Kant would attribute more freedom to it than that. So he's only interested in what makes it possible for us to see a purposiveness in nature. So what makes it possible for us to see a purposiveness in nature is not a conceptual understanding or a practical reason, but an aesthetic judgment. So if we keep in mind that the purpose of this argument, the whole point of it, is as an illustration of this faculty of aesthetic judgment. So he's not talking about like what nature is or isn't. He's just saying this helps us recognize this faculty that we have. This is an illustration. Right? So like the beautiful object or the sublime force as phenomena of aesthetic judgment, now the teleological being as an object of aesthetic judgment shows that there is an aesthetic judgment that is not reducible to, not explicable to, our conceptual, theoretical understanding, our pure reason, or our practical reason. Okay, so he's got two different notions of form. So if nature, again, like the example of the bird, if nature has a form in our subjective apprehension of it, well, again, there would be two ways in which that would be the case. There would be form in a logical sense, and then there would be form in an aesthetic sense. So form in a logical sense, he looks at, for instance, as geometrical or mathematical in character. Right, so it's kind of like what we were talking about last time with the mathematical sublime versus the dynamic sublime. Now this gets us to a question that was raised in the notes that you guys posted. What's meant by mechanism? Like what is mechanism? And why does Kant use that term the way he does? Okay, so this is going to be important for next week with Schiller, and therefore henceforth in the course. I don't know if I mentioned it to you guys. I don't think that I did because I don't think there would be the occasion. He does tangentially touch upon it here in this book, but he doesn't give a full argumentation about it. He's unhappy with Newton. So Isaac Newton is the sort of preeminent physicist, also mathematician, and those are related. So he's not happy with either Newtonian physics or the mathematics of Newtonian physics. He doesn't think it quite captures the full scope of our cognitive abilities. So what he accuses this of is mechanism, or a mechanical view of things. So it has to do with, I don't know if we talked about this, causality. It's something that's come up. But his dispute with Hume was that Hume thought causality is just a kind of fiction, that we have our kind of theories of causality, but our theories of causality don't have any substance, right? They're just generalizations of empirical observation. Whereas Kant says, well, okay, maybe we should not attribute causality to things in themselves. We can recognize them as constructs of our reason, but there is a substance to them, and that is the substance of our own subjective reason. Right, so maybe, the metaphysical assertion of causality doesn't apply to things in themselves or the world in itself, but only applies to our own cognitive faculties. Right, so there is, we don't just have to do empirical observation. Our theories can have a more substantive character than that, if we understand them to be subjective in character, subjective in nature. All right, so a mechanical view of the universe, a mechanical view of nature, a mechanical view of life is insufficient, according to Kant. So to use language that would be more familiar to us, although he does use these thought figures, mechanical versus organic. So a more organic view of life than a mechanical view of life, because literally that was the idea. So philosophers and scientists up to this time thought of living things as machines, as basically explicable as being mechanical in function. So what's the difference between an organic and a mechanical view of things?
Freedom.
Would be freedom, but let's think about what freedom means in this case. So if we go back to our dialectic of being and becoming, freedom means transformation.
Possibility, potential.
Right, so a kind of, the possibility of like growth and development, of a kind of open-ended kind of transformation. But transformation, let's stick on that point. So in a mechanism, for instance, one conception was a clockwork view of the universe. And then the question is, well, okay, the universe is like a clockwork mechanism, but then you have to wind up a clock. So how is it that the clock is moving? If it's a clockwork mechanism, well, then God must have not only made the clock, but set it in motion. So the idea that God exists because you needed a prime mover to set the mechanism in motion. So that was the predominant kind of metaphysical view of things, like that kind of conception of the universe. It's a divine clockwork with a prime mover, God, setting it in motion. What Kant thinks that neglects is that actually things change. So as things interact, they don't just remain the same. So in a clockwork mechanism, all the gears interact, but they remain the same even as they interact. An organic view of things would show that actually when things interact, they change each other. Right, so the universe has a kind of living appearance because it is constantly changing. And it's changing not just in a random, haphazard way, but seemingly in an ordered way. So that's why he wants a more organic conception of nature rather than a mechanical one. But reflexively, why would we be more satisfied by an organic view of the universe than a mechanical view of the universe? Aesthetically, it would please us to conceive of the universe organically rather than mechanically. Meaning, in that instance, we would regard the universe as alive because we're alive. Yeah, and so we would find it to be more satisfying to conceive of the universe organically rather than mechanically. So, but again, okay, when did people think of the universe as more organic than mechanical? Well, before the scientific revolution. But then you're getting into a realm of theology. In other words, if the universe is alive, it's because God is alive. So can we have a living view of nature, a living view of life, without that relying on God? Right, again, the existence or non-existence of which he's agnostic about. Right, so this is really the problem he's setting up. So he's saying, it seems like our choices are, God made the universe and put it in motion, or the universe is God, and the movement of the universe is the movement of God. The universe is alive because God is alive. That's basically Spinoza, or what he calls a kind of hylozoism. Right? Nature is alive because God is in nature. Right? Kind of monism, as opposed to the dualism of nature being created by God and then set in motion by God. Right, so he says, well, we can't really determine all that. All that we can determine is, again, philosophically, what's the proper domain of philosophy in this instance? It's to explain, analyze, and try to understand our own faculties. In which case, it would be interesting to know why an organic view of the universe is more, sits well with us better than a mechanical view. And why a mechanical view then sets up this problem of theology versus science. Because that's what it does. And we're still there, by the way. Right? We're still there where it's like, oh, scientists just have this dead view of things, but, that's insufficient. Like, science can explain how things work, but not why things are the way they are, and for that you need God, right? So there's no meaning without God. Science can't give us meaning, which is another way of thinking about purpose. You need religion for that. Okay, so what's Kant's answer to that? He's like, well, sure, but what are we doing when we're reaching for religion? In other words, how do we understand the religious explanation? Freedom, because we're putting freedom in God. That's the purposiveness, that's the teleology. So if the ultimate purpose of the universe is God's purpose, all we're doing there is attributing to God a kind of autonomy. And then philosophers came to the conclusion, if you've heard of this concept of the divine spark, philosophers are like, oh, why do we have this freedom, or why do we have this recognition of freedom? Well, because each of us has like a little bit of God in us, the divine spark. And again, for Kant, it's like, well, I don't know, maybe not. We can't really assert that unproblematically. What can we assert? We can assert that we are free. We can't assert why we're free, but we can assert that we are free. And because we're free, we therefore see the world the way we do. And we specifically see life the way we do. Oh, I mentioned this earlier in the course about the geometrical figures. He says, in so simple a figure as the circle lies the key to the solution of a multitude of problems, each of which would demand various appliances, whereas the solution results of itself, as it were, as one of the infinite number of elegant properties of this figure. Are we, for example, asked to construct a triangle, being given the base and vertical angle, the problem is indeterminate, i.e. it can be solved in an infinite number of ways. But the circle embraces them all together as the geometrical locus of the vertices of triangles satisfying the given conditions. Again, suppose that two lines are to cut one another so that the rectangle under the segments of the one should be equal to the rectangle under the segments of the other. The solution of the problem from this point of view presents much difficulty. But all chords intersecting inside a circle divide one another in this proportion. Other curved lines suggest other purposive solutions of which nothing was thought in the rule that furnished their construction. So here he's getting into basically the calculus. Right, so again, this is Newtonian mathematics and Newtonian physics. So I think that I mentioned that Plato had this semi-ironical idea that, okay, there aren't actual circles or straight lines or rectilinear forms in the universe, but we see them. Why do we see them? Because, according to Kant, because we desire them. According to Plato, because, well, they must exist somewhere in an ethereal realm of eternal forms of which this world is just an imperfect projection. Again, it's a semi-ironical assertion, whether he thinks that there really is an ethereal realm of eternal forms or not. The question is, we must believe that there is such a realm, because we're not empirically observing these things, but we are conceiving of them. Okay, so what Kant is saying is, well, actually it's in our freedom that we conceive of them. Now, why is that? Well, because even our geometrical understanding has evolved, has developed. So, looked at from the standpoint of the late 1700s, it's clear that mathematics and physics have developed over the course of thousands of years. Right? In the recent past, within living memory, new mathematical as well as new physical conceptions have come into being. Again, Newton. All right. So, we talked about this before. All right, so let's turn back to your notes. What are we doing? Oh, we're almost out of time, Jesus. Okay. Not good. Here's another aspect of the organic conception of nature, the organic conception of the universe, but also the organic conception of life. So if living beings are autonomous, they're kind of microcosms, because the universe is one thing and a life form is one thing, that you can analytically, you can conceptually, and even according to a kind of practical reason, in terms of how things work, you can break something down, but actually you can't, in reality, take apart either a form of life or the universe. Meaning that everything's inextricably connected. So that internal purposiveness similarly to our own cognitive faculties, meaning our own cognitive faculties, all the different aspects, all the different organs, all the different parts are inextricably connected with one another. And how do we experience that? They're all aspects of, constituents of our freedom, in the same way that all the parts of an animal or a plant are constituents of it being alive. All right, so who's answer this? Oh, this is me. If I can, Dave. Why is it important to find purpose in things? Why does it matter? Why does Kant think it matters that we see, that we find, but that we see a purpose in things? What does that tell us? I told you guys that there's one answer to everything. That we're free, right? So what does it tell us that we see a purpose in things? It tells us that we're free.
It's not trying to find an answer, so I think it's just confirmation over and over and over.
In a sense, yes. But again, confirmation in what way? So we don't prove our freedom by coming to a final determination. So again, it's not, science does work with determinate concepts. But science is always evolving, science is always changing. So the fact that we have determinate concepts in science doesn't prove our freedom. What proves our freedom is that we're constantly revising those concepts, that we're constantly developing our science. And that we'll never come to the end of it. It will never come to a final end. Right? So that's why the final end is not determinate, but indeterminate. The final end is not, in that sense, a final end. The final end is freedom. Right? So science doesn't prove that we're free. The transformation of science proves that we're free. Right. You could say animals figure things out. Animals are scientific. Animals do trial and error based on empirical data, right? But they tend to kind of do it the same way. Whereas we do it in different ways across history. We are developing in a qualitative sense. Right? We're not just increasing our scientific knowledge. In a qualitative sense, we're changing the character of our knowledge.
Would you say that Matrix is a very Kantian movie? Would you say Matrix is a very Kantian movie?
In what way? Maybe the Matrix is Kantian. How? Because it's subjective?
No, I mean, it's like, ultimately, they're all seeking for freedom. Freedom from
even the machines are seeking freedom, right? I mean, they are and they aren't, meaning the architect isn't. You guys know your matrix? But the oracle is. The oracle. And then the Indian couple with their child who makes rainbows, like they're the synthesis of the architect and the oracle, right? And then Neo, who is like pseudo-free, becomes actually free.
So
right?
He's Kant.
Yeah, so he's like the anarchist, like freedom, except it turns out it's not anarchism, it's just the machines resetting their system through Neo over and over again. Like, remember in the architect room and then all the TV screens, and it shows Neo like reacting angrily every time he's told you're not free. But then ultimately he is free, right? So ultimately he does defeat Agent Smith. And there's a kind of reconciliation. So it is a bit that. Meaning that not only the humans, because it starts out kind of anarcho-primitivist trash, it does. You need all three movies. It starts out, the second movie when they're dancing underground, that's just like, yeah, kill these humans. Like, the machines are coming, do that. Yes. Stop these monkeys. But then in the end, right, they transcend the mere human and the mere machine. That would, of course, be the freedom. Right? Because if freedom is just sort of like, just organic nature, just or if it's like pure kind of methodical determination, it can't be either of those things. Okay. The Matrix. I usually think of the Matrix as a good Marx metaphor. It's a good Marx metaphor because it's capitalism. Kant, have we made a good Kantian movie on this score, on aesthetics? Maybe not. I have to think about that one. What would be a good Kant movie? I don't think anyone has bothered. I think people have tried to make categorical imperative movies, and people have tried to make critique of pure reason movies, but I don't think anyone's tried to do an aesthetic of judgment movie.
It's hard to pinpoint what we don't know how to work.
But that's why actually maybe it would be through art that you could do it, right? And yet I feel like, yeah, they actually haven't tried to do that.
Perhaps it's only a suggestion instead of really just describing it.
Oh, you mean actually, like manifesting it phenomenally. Maybe. All right, so I'll see you guys next week. Schiller. You will also see that we will have some music that we'll listen to in class, and you can listen ahead. And that's Beethoven's Ode to Joy. Lyrics by Schiller.